down there during this discussion.
They tied it into our cleanup bill from TADT. It got added to our TADT.
Right, and it was last minute thing. It was towards the very end of the session, and Chairman Tom Rice, who chairs the Motor Vehicle Committee, wanted to do it for the industry. My discussions with the chairman was, this is too soon, too quick. We need to have a chance to figure out, what the formula does to the counties, all of that, and we need to wait. I'm not saying it's bad, because obviously more revenue sounds like a good thing, but as far as how we allocate it, we need to wait on that. And basically the message we got back was, no, they were going to pass it that year. And so, they were saying, they were looking, how do you disperse the money? And we told them, we said, we don't know how you disperse the money. Because at that time, I think we were under the impression that we did not know how much property taxes were being generated locally from these types of trucks. We were being told by the Department of Revenue that there's no way we really know how much we're getting, because it goes into under one account. Maybe it's motor vehicles. It was part of one account, and there was no way to separate it out. And so the discussion was, if you can't separate it out, then how do you allocate it? And the only other way to allocate it was based on overall digest, because we do know what the overall digest was. So there was those discussions that took place, but our ACCG's official position was, we're against passing this, and you guys are rushing something through, and it hadn't had a chance to be studied.
And then they set the value of the vehicle based on its weight, and it has no relationship to the actual market value of that vehicle. It's an arbitrary value there, and we don't have a clue as to how that's going to impact it. And that could be as significant as how it's redistributed back to the various counties. We don't know if we're going to get more money or less money. Or state said we're going to get more, but who knows?
Yeah. What is the committee's thoughts? Would you like for us to bring back a recommendation at the next meeting?
I definitely think we need to act on it before the distribution is yet replaceable, like you said. You need to do something now instead of waiting to happen.
Right. Okay, we will work with the industry to see. I think that industry doesn't care what kind of the allocation formula.
They got what they want.
They got what they wanted, and it wasn't the allocation. They don't care about that. So I think we can get the allocation formula changed. Now, if there's a problem, like Dan said, with the overall pot not being what they projected it to be, that will be another issue, and that may be more difficult to get that changed. But we'll look into that. Anybody else in here interested? I know you all are interested in this, so I'll definitely keep you on the list. If any discussions we have with the industry, we'll probably set up a meeting with the industry just to talk to them about this. Anybody else?
I got a question. I don't know how the trucking industry affects these other counties, but the trucking industry in our county is log trucks and lots of them, even though we're a small county. So my question would be, how does our situation compare with what you're trying to do?
This would only impact trucks that register under IRP, which is traditionally those that go out of state. So your delivery type trucks. Now, unless you live on the border and you've got these log trucks that are going to, say, Florida back and forth, then they're probably not registering under IRP, so it wouldn't affect you.
We've got some going to Florida, but I mean, most of them are in state.
Right. Yeah, if they stay within state, then they're not registering under IRP.
Right.
Yeah, and their value is based on the value of the vehicle and the value of the trailer, and so they're under normal.
Yeah, okay, that answers my question.
Anybody else in the room other than Franklin County want to participate in any discussions with the motor trucking industry on this topic? Okay. That was the last new item under property tax. Before we move off of property tax onto sales tax, does anybody else have an issue on property tax? We're going to cover some of this in our platform. We're about running 10 minutes behind now. So, yes.
Well, I guess I had a question. I came thinking I might hear something about House Bill 954 about evaluation of these low-income properties. In a small county like ours, it might not be important to some counties, but in a small county like ours, where you got a number of these complexes, how it's valued can take a big hit as far as our revenue is concerned. And I was hoping that
those of you that aren't familiar with House Bill 954, it did pass this year. It was signed by the governor, so it will be law. I believe the effective date's July 1. But this is how you value primarily I think it's Section 42, what they call Section 42 housing. So it's subsidized housing, but it's the developers, when they build the housing, get a credit on the front end from the Department of Community Affairs. The federal government has a grant program, it's housed with DCA, and to encourage this type of housing, they provide grants to the developers, and then in exchange for the developer receiving that grant, they're able to give subsidized rental rates for, I think it's usually 30-year period. They're required to by that, entering into that agreement. The industry came to the General Assembly this year, and they were complaining that the county shouldn't value that property as if it was non-subsidized rent. That it wasn't fair that they were having that they couldn't sell their property, that they could only charge so much rent, and yet they were getting valued like somebody else in the community that charged full market rates of rent. Of course, our argument to them was they got the subsidy on the front end. Yes, they take less in rent over the life of the project, but they got all their money on the front end. And a lot of times they sell those credits off and generate a lot of revenue up front. The General Assembly, though, we opposed it. ACCG opposed the legislation all the way through the process. But at the end of the day, the General Assembly agreed to pass that legislation. So I think now the question is, can you go back and unwind that? Obviously, it's always very difficult to unwind tax legislation. There was also a lot of discrepancy across the state on how that property was being valued prior to this legislation. Some of the counties, especially in the northern part of the state, were saying they were already valuing it that way, where counties in some of the counties in the southern part of the state were saying they weren't valuing it that way. And so the General Assembly was hearing the differences across the state and saying there's got to be some uniformity here. Sean Adams on our staff actually worked on that legislation. So Sean, do you want to say a few words about that legislation?
One of the things that we did get, and actually Michael got it with JoAnn work on this a little bit too from their standpoint, but one of the things we brought into it was to make sure that if you have a market rate apartment complex next to some Section 42 apartment complexes, that those market rate complexes can't now try to use the value, these new adjusted values of the Section 42 properties to argue their view. And I understand, and I think some of our tax assessor friends can speak to this a lot better than I can, but I have a feeling, my understanding is this legislation is going to impact the appeals process when you start to deal with the income approach versus if you're using the cost approach on the front end on a new building.
worked with the assessors, though, to get out some best practices on how to value that type of property now under the new law. Also, there's an attorney, I hope I don't get this wrong because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I believe it's Walter Elliott. He's an attorney down around Lowndes County. He's the one that believes that the law that they just passed is not constitutional, and they plan to challenge it. They're going to go ahead and do things like they've been doing them, and when they get sued over it, they're going to argue that that law is unconstitutional. He's a pretty smart guy. He's the one that challenged the binding arbitration under Lost and got that overturned by the Supreme Court. So he's already won before on that kind of stuff. But he plans. I just want you to know that there's not agreement about the constitutionality of that law that was passed, and there are plans to challenge it. And that may be the easiest thing to do. Obviously, it's very hard to go back to the General Assembly to address something they passed, but we can challenge it in the court system. But if you want to get with me offline after the meeting, I'll be glad to maybe give you some of these contacts and help you. Okay, we're going to move on to sales tax. We just have two new items. The first one really just to make you aware of, there's a joint study committee that's been created between ACCG and GMA, the Georgia Municipal Association, to look at the local option sales tax renegotiation process as well as service delivery. They've already had one meeting. They're going to be meeting again soon, but they're going to have a number of meetings throughout this year, and then they're going to come up with some recommendations. So this committee, we're just sort of waiting to see what kind of recommendations that they come up with. Everybody recognizes that the current Lost negotiation process doesn't work very well, that the binding arbitration process now has been thrown out by the Supreme Court of Georgia, and that next time you have to renegotiate Lost, we're going to be faced with the tax being eliminated or going away unless you reach an agreement with your cities. If we're going to do something on this law, it would be better to do it now rather than wait a year or two prior to the next round of negotiations. The closer we get to the next round of negotiations, the harder it will be to change law, because everybody then that's at the table says, I'm going to be the one having to sit there and negotiate, and I don't want the law changed because I don't think it works in my favor, or, everybody has their opinion on it. Where right now we can have some rational conversation around it, knowing it's a period of time before we have to do it again. So we are working on that. I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that. Again, if you all have any thoughts about what we should do, I can tell you that there's discussion going on whether it should be formula driven. In other words, should you put it sort of a formula in law that drives it so there really is no negotiation at all? Or should you go back into the criteria that's required in the negotiations and better define the criteria, or better structure the negotiations themselves so you improve the negotiations but you don't eliminate the negotiations? Those are all some of the things that are taking place in conversation around that topic. The next item on your agenda is I've had a number of counties that have gotten interested in the homestead option sales tax. For those of you that aren't familiar with host, you cannot do a host and a loss together. So most everybody in this room has a loss, so you've been precluded from even being able to explore the possibility of doing a homestead option sales tax. However, we've got some counties now that are interested in trying to move to a homestead option sales tax, because it provides a lot more tax relief to homesteader property. I know one of the arguments I've heard is if we're going to give property tax relief to property owners, we ought to start by trying to prioritize and give that property tax relief to homesteader property, because that's non-income producing property, and that's the kind of property that people complain about is if you don't pay your property taxes, the government takes your home. And that's the place you live, and that's not fair that the government can come take your own home and you never own it. I mean, that's some of the rhetoric we get here down there. But the policy argument is if you're going to give property tax relief, that's where you should put the priority, on the homesteader property first. With loss, as you know, it gets spread out amongst all types of property, including all the income producing types of property. So your industrial, manufacturing, commercial, they all get a piece of that. So it's very little. So for loss, if you were to do your own analysis and figure out how much savings your property taxpayers are really getting, it may only be 5 or 10%. Versus if it were to go away, that's what their property tax bill would go up. Where with host, in many cases, you can wipe out people's county property taxes completely with a host. In fact, we've had 2 counties in the state that have implemented host. One's DeKalb and one's Rockdale. Dan, this year it was about 98% of the county property taxes that you're wiping out with it?
2013, he was able to move back to 100%.
So you're at 100%, wiping out 100% of the county property taxes with it?
Yes, we, the first 4 years of it, we were able to do 100%, and the economy hit us for sales taxes collapsed. We went maybe 3 years, I think the lowest point was 70%. And over the next 2 years, we were able to, get it up to like 80%, 85%, and last year we would go back to 100%.
Yeah. So anyways, it depends on your situation, obviously, and your sales tax base relative to your property tax base of how much you could wipe out. But it does allow you to give a whole lot more property tax relief to your homeowners. So more bang for your buck there. And again, it's a policy decision. Some of you may say, no, I think we ought to give a little bit of property tax relief to everybody. We shouldn't target homeowners. Others of you may think you should target your homeowners. But under current law, you don't even have that option to make those choices. You're stuck with what you got. So what's been asked of us by some of the counties that are interested in this is that we go in and look at the law to see if we can reform the law to make it simpler for you to transition from one type of local sales tax to another. So if you want to put it to your voters, then you would be able to do that. Under current law, you can't transition. You've got to get rid of one, and sometimes it's impossible to get rid of one. And then you got to wait a period of time and implement another one. And from a practical standpoint, it doesn't work. You can't, from a practical standpoint, really go from one type of local sales tax to another. So if from a policy standpoint, if your voters wanted you to give more property tax relief for the same amount of money to the homeowners, we would have to change state law to allow for that, and current law doesn't allow for that. So I bring that to your attention, this committee, whether you all would like to, for me to put together maybe a draft statement to look at at the next meeting that would allow for counties, again, it's strictly optional, but for counties to look at putting on the county ballot a conversion of one to the other. Of course, I will tell you, Michael's in the back of the room with GMA. This I will tell you up front, this is going to be a sticking point with the Georgia Municipal Association. I'm not going to speak for Michael, but my guess is the GMA will oppose this tooth and nail. Maybe not.
We just had our LPC meeting last week, our Legislative Policy Council meeting, and the recommendation of the for our committees this June is to not oppose post anymore, but to propose a alternate form of post to enhance it a little bit, to include a most, wherever it may be imposed. So that's
Okay.
the position he takes. So we're not against it anymore by any means.
So there may be some room to negotiate with GMA over this in exchange for certain things, right? So open the door for a host if you have open the door for a most if you have a host. That's what us lobbyists call down there friendly way to kill legislation. You don't oppose it, you just tack on stuff you know the other side's not going to like. But again, that's been recommended. Y'all have a problem with me putting together a draft at least for y'all to look at and consider? It's something y'all would have to vote on at the next meeting if we're going to put it in there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I need to look at it.
Okay, I'll do that.
But before you get off of that, what's the big problem with lost again? Run that by me one more time.
Well, with local option sales tax, a lot of people have had very contentious negotiations with their cities over the new distribution certificates on when you had to resplit the lost. And because of the Supreme Court decision, we're back we're back to where if you fail to negotiate, the tax terminates. And it's damaged a lot of county and city relations across the state because I'll tell you those criteria that you're supposed to consider in the law can be very ambiguous, and you can argue it both ways. I mean, counties got good arguments, cities have good arguments. There's no weighting of the criteria. It becomes very much of a political battle over, basically nobody just wants to lose anything. They want to at least get what they used to get, either side. And so there really can't be any meaningful negotiations over loss under the current setup. And if we're ever going to have meaningful negotiations, or if we're going to have what somebody feels like is a fair way to split it across the entire state, it's going to require state law to do it. I think you all went through some pretty contentious loss negotiations. Did you in your county, or you didn't?
No,
Okay.
they were the first ones in the
Oh,
state.
you're first to settle,
Yeah.
okay. Some counties had no problem with it. It tends to, I will tell you, it tends to be the non-growth counties that really haven't had a lot of growth in the past 20 or 30 years. They tend to just leave it just like it is, and it's not a big deal. But in areas of the state where there is a lot of change in growth, and sometimes the growth is in the city, sometimes it's in the unincorporated area, that tends to be where a lot of the friction occurs, because one side doesn't want to change it,